Thank you very much, and wonderful to be back. Thank you, Steffi. And I think one of the best things about DLD is that it brings together the startup, the surfers, and the Nobel Prize winners. So it's fantastic to have you here. You won the Nobel for a topic that we will not talk about today.
Right.
I would be totally out of my depth, but you've been working on a new theory and a new thesis that is really interesting also for this audience, because it deals with the voice we all have as shareholders. Tell us a little bit about this to start with.
Okay, well, first, thanks very much. It's great to be here. I don't know how interesting I can be, but I'll try. So the conventional wisdom among economists, people in finance and law, for a long time, the wisdom has been that companies should act on behalf of their owners, the shareholders, and what the shareholders want is for the companies to make as much money as possible, which makes the shareholders wealthy, and then they can use that wealth as they wish. In my work, in recent work with co-authors, we've argued that the first part of that is correct, that companies should act on behalf of shareholders, but the second part is incorrect, because who are the ultimate shareholders, the ultimate owners of companies? They are people like you and me, human beings, and in our private lives, we don't just maximize income or profit. We have social concerns as well. And, to give some examples, we put solar panels on our houses, or we buy electric cars, or we buy free-range chicken. And sometimes these are not the most cost-efficient things to do, but we do them at least partly because we think they're the right thing to do. So given that's the way we behave in our own lives, wouldn't we want the companies that we own to behave like that as well? I mean, just to give an example, imagine a company has a choice between dumping some waste in a river. It could be a river, it could be in a country far away. Imagine there are no regulations against this, but dumping the waste in the river is going to cause, very likely to cause illness and death. So the company can do that, or it could incinerate the waste and not dump it in the river and avoid the harm. But that would cost some money. So the traditional view would be, well, if there's no regulation against it, the company should maximize profit. It shouldn't incinerate, it should just dump the waste. That's the more profitable strategy. But if you think about the shareholders of that company, if you ask them what they would like, they might well say, you know what, we don't like the idea of dumping this waste and causing illness and death. We're willing to take a lower dividend in return for you not doing that. If you accept that way of thinking, that leads to some fairly radical changes. I mean, it suggests that what companies should do is to find out what their shareholders want, instead of just assuming they want to maximize profit or market value or shareholder value. They should actually find out what the shareholders want, what kind of trade-offs they're willing to make. And that's, of course, more complicated because the shareholders may not agree, and so you have to aggregate their preferences in some way. And just to give a second example, these days, many shareholders, many people own their investments in firms through mutual funds. And the same point applies to them. The people who run mutual funds should be finding out from their own investors what trade-offs they're willing to make. So when these managers of mutual funds engage with companies or vote on behalf of people like you and me on shareholder resolutions, when they do that kind of thing, instead of assuming that the right thing for them to do is always to be pushing for the profit maximizing outcome, they should actually be finding out from the investors what kind of trade-offs they're willing to make, and then change their engagement and voting strategy accordingly.
Just a quick poll of the audience. Who's ever been asked what kind of vote they would exercise if they could? Not many, so there seems to be a market. Who would like to be asked? Who has ever exercised their vote as a shareholder through proxy or directly? Okay, so that seems to be definitely a market. Tell me about the fiduciary duty of managers. Doesn't that conflict with what you're saying?
Yeah, I think this is a problem. So I think this perspective suggests that we need some changes in the law, and this is particularly the case in the US, where a pretty narrow view of fiduciary duty is has been adopted by the courts, and also by Congress. So in many cases, if you talk to CEOs, executives, or fund managers about the kind of thing I'm talking about, they'll say, oh, but we are constrained. We have a duty of loyalty. Fiduciary duty means a duty of loyalty. We have a duty of loyalty to our investors to maximize long-run financial return. That's what they argue. I think, yeah, so, and in some cases, as you were saying, the law actually requires them to do that. But I think the law is mistaken, because surely fiduciary duty or duty of loyalty, it means acting on behalf of the people you're representing. So if they actually, to go back to my example, if they would like the company not to dump waste in the river, they're willing to take a lower dividend, then surely the loyal thing to do, if you're a fund manager, is to push the company not to do that, rather than it seems like a breach of loyalty to push the company to maximize profit if your own investors don't actually want that. But the law doesn't currently recognize that, so I think we need to change the law. I think in the rest of the world, there's a bit more flexibility.
Now, shareholder resolutions tend to be the most boring thing you can read before you fall asleep. What could technology do? You told me about an example of where technology can help to have shareholders exercise their vote.
Yes. So I don't think the shareholder resolutions, I think the proxy statements, yes, if you ever get things, you know, in the mail, or it used to be in the mail, now it's email, saying, you know, the annual meeting is coming up and we're going to be voting on the following things. Most of those things are incredibly boring because they are just reappointing directors who you've never heard of these people, and there's no contest. Or, you know, another thing would be we need to reappoint the auditor. You know, please vote to yes on that. Well, you know, these are things that are very boring. But these days we see a number of resolutions initiated by shareholders which are a bit more interesting, which are calling on companies to disclose, let's say, how much plastic waste they are producing and the impact of that on the environment. That kind of thing is more interesting. Nonetheless, it is asking a lot for shareholders to be involved in all this voting, because you know, if you have a diversified portfolio, you invest in an index fund, then you hold a little bit of a huge number of companies, and that means you're going to be deluged with proxy statements. And you know, you've got a day job, or you like to watch TV at night, or whatever it is. You don't really want to spend your evenings studying the proxy statements. But there is a way around this, which is that and actually, there's somebody I just spoke to last week who's setting up something like this, where some company would ask you questions about what you care about, and so you would sort of participate in a questionnaire, a personalized questionnaire. It would be asking you, how much do you care about the environment? How important do you think lobbying is? Do you think it's a mistake for companies to make political contributions? These kinds of questions. And they can be more nuanced than that. So you can sort of, once somebody has said they care about the environment, you could go a little further and find out the kind of trade-offs they're willing to make. And so somebody can answer these questions, and that will indicate how they want to vote on things which are coming up at company annual meetings. And then, once you've done this, somebody else or an algorithm can figure out how you should be voting at the meeting. So then you can, you know, go back to watching TV at night and not worry about it anymore. Effectively, you've delegated your vote, but according to preferences that you have specified.
Now, that's one way to exercise influence, but wouldn't it be easier to just change the regulatory framework for companies?
Like most economists, I think the ideal solution when we're talking about externalities, and in the case of, climate change is the biggest externality of all time. So, the vast majority of economists, and myself included, would think that the best thing is to have government action. Most economists like the idea of a carbon tax, a worldwide carbon tax. The trouble with that is it's politically very unpopular. It's hard enough to get it implemented in one country, let alone across the world. And instead, we see countries doing different things, like subsidizing things rather than taxing things, rather than the carbon tax. But I think the bottom line is it's really, we see there's a lot of political stalemates these days, and it's very hard to get things done, particularly the international level. It's very important that we keep trying, but unless we succeed, or until we succeed there, surely we should be doing everything we can on all the other dimensions as well, as individuals, as companies. So I see these things as complementary, but I don't think we can just sit back and say, let's wait for regulation to solve the problems.
We've got time for 2 questions, and I just want to, because it's such a rare occasion, I just want to give the audience the opportunity to ask 2 questions. The first ones, get the microphone. 1 question. There's a question over there.
How do you rate the models that are measuring impact as an additional KPI for stock performance, for company performance? So there are a tonic meter or other things where you can measure kind of the impact the company has additionally to the financial return, and also use this as KPI for the performance in total.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's all very good, because that will help shareholders push companies in the direction they want. They can see, has the company, if you're measuring carbon footprint, say, and the shareholders have indicated they would like it to come down unless it's too costly, then you can see the next year whether they've done it. It also is going to enable you to incentivize CEOs and the board appropriately, according to the shareholder wishes. So I think that's all positive.
Maya has got the second question.
I would like to ask you, yes, it is politically difficult, but if you thought about where is the window of opportunity biggest or the least small in the next 2 to 3 years to get some of that regulatory change that you've talked about through, where would you go for? Where would you push if you had in lines to try to bring about some that could be a role model for other places then? Would it be something on the European level? Would it be somewhere else? Like, where would that governance change or regulatory change be most likely, even though it's difficult?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch. Are you talking about regulation or what I'm talking about?
No, you mentioned as well that we do have to have policy and regulatory change, and you said it's hard. But I would love to hear from you, where do you think it might be the most feasible?
Where? You mean which country?
Yes, I think we often...
I don't know, but I think if I look at the country I live in, it seems very, well, some things have been done, under the Biden administration, but it's very hard, now there's deadlock there, as you know. So, but I'm more interested, so I'm thinking more about what can be done at the company level, and I think, there are possibilities in many countries to improve governance, to give shareholders more voice. That's what in a nutshell, since I'm very aware that we're running out of time. So in a nutshell, what I'm advocating is the following. When it comes to the political sphere, we think of democracy as being a good thing, right? Most of us, not everybody does, but I think probably most of the people here would agree with that. Well, I think in the corporate sector, the same thing applies. We should have shareholder democracy. Shareholder voice has been kind of shut up, partly because the view has been, well, we all know what the shareholders want. They just want more money, so we don't need to ask them. But once you recognize that shareholders have social preferences because they're human beings, and that companies, they want companies to incorporate those preferences, then we need to have mechanisms for shareholder voice to be heard. So I want to bring democracy into the corporate arena.
Can I just ask for permission for one last question, because it's from Stanford against Harvard? If you keep it very short, we can maybe get that in.
First, Oliver, thank you so much for, I've been on boards of companies and people appeal to the Milton Friedman mindset. It has to be all about money. So I appreciate you laying out a rationale for considering some of the other implications. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on how you imagine companies responding once this becomes more pervasive. Do you imagine companies not only advertising their ROI and their products and so forth, but also the kinds of social goals that they're going after? And then shareholder sorting, and some of them, different shareholders may have different preferences, sorting into different companies, even in the same industry, that achieve different non-economic goals.
Yes, I mean, that can certainly happen. And, sorting is another way. You can have shareholders voting with their feet. But I think these days, a lot of shareholders hold index funds. I mean, those have become very popular. So if you do that, you're in every company. And so that's the situation where I think the voice becomes particularly important. You're not going to be exiting, and instead, I have a paper, if anybody's interested, called Exit versus Voice, where we compare the two strategies in terms of which is going to be more effective in getting companies to do the right thing environmentally, say. Is it more effective to use your vote to push them, or is it more effective to sell your shares and invest only in clean companies? And we argue, and I think it's sort of very intuitive, that actually the exit strategy, which I think is the sorting strategy, is very unlikely to succeed, because if you're a socially responsible person and you get out of a dirty company, first of all, hedge funds are going to jump in and buy your shares. And who's going to end up as the new shareholders of this dirty company? People who are less socially responsible than you, who may be pushing it to be dirtier. So I think it's much better to actually stick with the dirty companies and use your voice. But I think, to answer your question, I would like to see a situation where, and maybe this is naive, where boards actually want to find out what their shareholders want instead of trying to shut them up.
Thank you very much. We could continue for hours, and you're here for the day. And anyone
happy to talk to
in the board discussions, please come and speak to Oliver. But thank you very, very much for being here, and thank you for